Welcome to Talking Fraud, a podcast series by MIAA, providing you with informal insights on all things fraud. This podcast was recorded in November 2022, and all information within the podcast is correct at the time of recording. Episode 2, How does an anti-fraud service work? Hi and welcome to Episode 2 of Talking Fraud, the podcast of MIAA's anti-fraud service. I'm Paul Bell, the host for today, Senior Manager with MIAA's anti-fraud team, and I'm joined with Darryl Davies, who's the head of the anti-fraud function, and also Claire Smallman, who's Senior Investigations Manager with MIAA. Today we're going to follow on from our original episode, which really talked about the origins and the background to NHS counter fraud, how it came about, what it looks like today, what it looked like 20 years ago when it was set up. In this episode, we're going to sort of focus a bit around what exactly is NHS counter fraud, what does the strategy consist of, what is it that we do as counter fraud specialists in the NHS. So I'm going to open this up. I'm going to ask Darryl a question initially in terms of, what are your thoughts about the NHS counter fraud strategy, the key components that we've been following probably for the last 10, 15 years?
Well, thank you for that, Paul. Easing me in gently.
You're welcome.
So it's great to be back here again on this second episode of Talking Fraud.
What's it called again?
I think it's called Talking Fraud, isn't it? Yes.
Thank you.
There's a running joke now about whether we covered it enough in the first episode, so we will make numerous references to it throughout the course of this particular episode. But yes, interesting question. I mean, there are 4 key elements of the national strategy that we're required to follow and deliver against during the course of any particular year that we're working with our clients. And those 4 areas cover the principles of raising awareness, so making sure that people know about fraud, are up to date on the latest scams and attempts by fraudsters to try and defraud them, be it on an organisational level or on a personal level as well. We also do some work around detection and prevention, so strengthening controls processes. And then we do some work on investigations, as you touched on already, where we look at allegations of fraud and take them through to their logical conclusion, be that a criminal outcome or an internal process. And also as well, we have a responsibility to report to the organisations that we work to explain what we've been doing and the outcomes from our work. And that's badged under what the Counter Fraud Authority call strategic governance. So I suppose thinking of all those 4, we should perhaps approach them one at a time and maybe go into a bit more detail about what each of those areas actually involves and how we operate. Yeah,
I think just to sort of take a step back, I suppose we should sort of mention what's our relationship between our clients, so who we perform counter fraud services for across the NHS. So a little bit about MIAA, really. I suppose we've got a team of about 15 individuals, I think it is at the moment. Yeah. And we basically work across the northwest and north of England. So probably from North Wales across to, down to probably the Midlands, and then across to Lancashire and up to Cumbria. So quite a large geographical area. So we've got a team of about 15 individuals, variety of backgrounds and experience. Myself, Darryl and Claire are the senior managers of the function. We've probably got about 60 odd years of experience and that's scary when you say that out loud.
It is.
Between us, but we've got a lot of other individuals with a range of experience in the team. And we currently provide counter fraud services to around 30 NHS organisations. So quite a lot of experience, quite a lot of different types of organisations within the NHS. So that's pretty much sort of the context of where MIAA is coming from, talking around NHS counter fraud issues. We have an accountability locally to each of the organisations. So every NHS organisation needs to have its own dedicated, nominated counter fraud specialist. There's a reason for that we'll talk to in terms of the awareness raising activities. So there's a key focal point for that organisation. But we also have a dotted line of accountability through to what is now the NHS Counter Fraud Authority. And we talked about the origins of them in the previous episode. So I suppose really, and sort of feel free to chip in here in terms of, the role of NHS Counter Fraud Authority. But they kind of set the national strategy, the sort of national agenda. Originally, they came up with the 4-part structure that we're going to talk about in a bit more detail. They will provide guidance on centralised policy, so there's consistency in approach across counter fraud in the NHS in the widest sense. And also they have an investigative remit, particularly in areas that are cut across different boundaries. So we kind of have a dotted line of accountability to them, but fundamentally, as Daryl sort of mentioned, we have a direct line of accountability to normally the senior finance officer in our clients. And they're the ones who sort of direct our report and we report to. So that's just a bit of the context and the background in terms of the strategy itself, really. But going back to Daryl's points around raising awareness, maybe if we talk around inform and involve activities and a little bit about that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, I think, the inform and involve is a crucial part of what we do. If people don't know who we are, don't know anything about fraud, then the likelihood is we're not going to receive referrals. We're not going to be able to stop and target and get that money back into the NHS and into the areas. So some of the work we do around that is presentations. We will go out and deliver presentations to staff. That may be staff who are new to the organisation or bespoke organisational teams, finance teams, procurement, where there may be a higher risk area. But there's a whole host, and certainly with COVID times, we've had to readjust how we then carry on delivering fraud awareness with regards to that, and change the ways that we do so. So, podcasts is one of those areas that this is new to us as 3 fraud officers working within the NHS with an investigation background. Doing podcasts is very new to what we do. So again, it's just looking at these areas of how we can get the messages across to members of staff, to members of the public as well, in terms of NHS fraud. Videos, maybe we've done animated videos that we're also issuing out to our clients for staff. So there's a whole host of things that we do.
And I think as well, we've also made use of other media, haven't we? So I think very importantly, what you said there, as well as targeting people who work within our client organisations, we've also done some more general pieces to the general public. So we have used, community radio. A number of our team have participated in the BBC One programme, Fraud Squad, to highlight investigations and the outcome of those investigations. There is, I think, a growing appetite amongst the general public to be informed about these kind of areas. And I think, we've changed over the years in moving away from becoming quite focused on clients to actually trying to spread the message a bit wider as well. And I think, the CFA also kind of help with that as well in terms of their kind of national profile in helping to kind of promote that general awareness message.
I think it's probably worth pointing out, before we get too far into the more detailed discussion around what we do, who commits NHS fraud, just for the benefits of those that may be new to this podcast and this particular topic. So it can be anybody who can commit NHS fraud. It can be those employed by the NHS, it can be patients, it can be visitors to the NHS, can be suppliers to the NHS. So
contractors.
There isn't particularly, any restriction. And then you've got individuals who are completely external to the organisation, your organised fraudsters, who may not even be in the same country, and maybe committing fraud online, cyber-enabled fraud activities. So I think it's probably worth, pointing out that anybody can commit fraud against the NHS. And,
absolutely.
Our remit would be to, investigate that in its widest sense, potentially in conjunction with other investigative bodies like the police or the Counter-Fraud Authority or whoever else it might be. Just thinking as well, do you think it's probably worth us just giving a quick overview of what is fraud? We're making some assumptions here that people know what fraud is, but what are your thoughts in terms of what's the easiest way to explain fraud to somebody who's maybe not that familiar with it or doesn't understand particularly how it is as a criminal offence?
Yeah, I think most people probably understand the concept of theft, which is obviously taking somebody else's property with the intention of not returning it, and keeping it for your own benefit. And I think fraud and theft are very, very similar. And the only real distinction is that for it to be a fraud, then you're actively trying to deceive somebody, and it's the act of deceiving that separates it from being straightforward theft. And when I present to various staff groups, I always use an analogy of the petrol station. So an individual who turns up at a petrol station, fills their car up with fuel, and just drives off with it without paying is essentially straightforward theft. You're taking the petrol, you've got no intention of returning it. Whereas if that same person drives up to the petrol station, fills up with fuel, and then goes into the kiosk and hands over either a forged banknote or a clone credit card to pay for the pay for the petrol, when what they're handing over as a method of payment they know to be fraudulent, then they're trying to deceive the cashier, and that's where the distinction, to my mind, comes in between straightforward theft and fraud.
Definitely. Obviously, it's, the element of deception, isn't it, in terms of, and like you say, the analogy you used, Darryl, when I do my presentations, I use similar ones around, working in a staff canteen, stealing money out of the till. But then if I try to hide the fact that I'd stolen that money by putting some false receipts or creating some false invoicing, there's the element of deception, and then can become a fraud. And I think, that it is very similar in terms of people not understanding quite what fraud is, like you said, Paul. And, the Fraud Act that came in, the Fraud Act 2007, but it's the Fraud Act 2006.
Well done.
That came in. There's a whole host of offences under that Fraud Act that, we use ultimately. I mean, the Crown Prosecution Service will be the ones who make the deciding factor as to what somebody is prosecuted under. But, fraud by false representation is one of the offences under the Fraud Act, Section 2.
Which is?
There you go, Section 2. Failure to disclose information is another one, and one of the other ones we use is Section 4, fraud by abuse of position as well. So, as I say, when we receive an allegation of fraud, we investigate it thoroughly, we follow all key lines of inquiry, and we will have a sort of insight as to what kind of offence we believe has been committed, but ultimately it will lie with the CPS in charging.
And I think the introduction of specific fraud and also bribery legislation has also helped us in what we do, because it, as you said, clarifies exactly what fraud offences are. I think prior to these acts coming into being, a lot of fraud cases were pursued under the old Theft Act, and would collapse very often because the legislation wasn't specifically geared up to prosecute fraud offences. So I think those two acts in particular were a big game changer in the UK.
It's probably worth pointing out, and we're not going to get too much into legislation because that's a particularly dry subject. We're not that knowledgeable about it, probably. But I think, whenever we are talking to anybody who'll listen to us fundamentally about fraud topics, we do try and explain the fraud offences in easily understandable terms. So, Claire, you mentioned about fraud by false representation. So it's basically misdirection or deception. And a typical example of that would be someone lying on their CV or falsifying an expense claim. You're creating a false document.
Or somebody selling designer aftershaves or clothes online when actually they're knockoff. Yeah. That would be another example in kind of, people's kind of day-to-day lives that they may recognise.
You're wearing some of that aftershave today, Darryl?
Absolutely. Ode to fraud.
Thank God it's not Scratch and Sniff podcast.
Absolutely.
So I think the other point you mentioned as well that's probably worth sort of focusing on is, we are talking about NHS fraud, but our remit also includes bribery and corruption in the NHS as well. And you mentioned two significant pieces of legislation, the 2006 Fraud Act that came in 2007 and the 2010 Bribery Act. Prior to that, the legislation was about 100 years old. So they definitely needed modernising. And I think that's helped get the message out there in terms of relevance. And the acts are relatively sort of simple and straightforward, I think, but we do convey those in layman's terms. So I think that's enough about the legislation.
Absolutely. I won't say another word.
What's this podcast called again, Darryl?
It's called Talking Fraud, not
Excellent.
Talking Legislation. That's the next one.
Well, maybe. We'll discuss that later. So to go back to the strategy itself and raising awareness, the strategy has very much been sort of called Inform and Involve, and the four elements, inform and involve, prevent and deter, strategic governance and hold to account, have been the cornerstones of the NHS Counter Fraud strategy for about 18 years. And I think it was last year that they've actually slightly modified it. And when I say they, I'm talking about the NHS Counter Fraud Authority. So the inform and involve and prevent and deter is now part of counter fraud activities. So you still have the governance element. We are still accountable to the organisation for the work that we do. And we still do the investigations, but everything else is just kind of now badged under counter fraud activities. But the fundamental elements of that, of getting the message out there, raising awareness, we can't investigate fraud if people don't know what fraud is and don't know how to spot it. So the front end of what we do is raising awareness.
Absolutely. And I think, that we talk about inform and involve. I think the key word in that is involve. That we need to get buy-in from the organisations that we work in to kind of take ownership of the fact that they're the kind of key custodians of that organisation, and they have a responsibility to kind of make sure that they work with us to kind of prevent fraud, and also to raise concerns with us, because we can't do everything ourselves. As Paul touched on earlier, we do have a fraud officer in each NHS organisation, but very often they're only delivering a relatively small amount of days per year to that particular client. So there is a great deal of reliance we place on cooperation with various departments, various individuals within organisations to kind of build on the work that we're promoting. So I think the involvement side of it to me is really fundamental in what we do.
Absolutely. And I think also, when the figures come out that there's, over £1 billion worth of fraud lost in the NHS, from an investigation point of view, we don't see those kind of values coming through the doors on referrals. And that, is around what we need to do in terms of raising the awareness so people can identify potentially what a fraud is, to be able then to report it through the correct channels to ourselves as the local counter fraud specialist or the National NHS Counter Fraud Authority.
So we mentioned in this episode and the previous one about the particular challenges that COVID presented to us in terms of getting the message out and needing to think about different ways of doing that, hence, podcasts like these. But at the same time as well, we get referrals from individuals employed across the NHS. And because a lot of people were working from home, people weren't necessarily seeing what colleagues and other people are up to, so weren't seeing the concerns that they had to then raise awareness and report issues. So there was a little bit of a drop-off, I think, during the pandemic in terms of referrals received. And that was because everybody's working remotely and not necessarily being the eyes and ears of the organisations.
That's a big challenge, isn't it? And I think although we have seen, hopefully, the end of the pandemic in terms of the scale of lockdowns, etc., that we've seen previously, I think the key thing, that we need to think about is that the pandemic has changed the way in which people work now. Going forward, things haven't returned to normal, and I'm not sure necessarily they ever will. I think there's probably a new normal now, which involves people spending more time working at home and working remotely. So I think the challenge for us is how do we, what systems and processes need to be in place that we can recommend to kind of strengthen the overall control environments while still recognising that people are actually not in the office anymore. And how do we make sure that referrals are being fed through to us? I think, this new way of working does present a whole host of challenges that we really need to be thinking about over the next kind of 12 months.
Yeah, and I think we've also touched on the sort of current climate financially for individuals. So there is the possibility that, more people will be committing fraud because there's a desperate need for cash to, pay their utility bills. So there is, for me, a likelihood that there could be an increase in fraud referrals, or certainly fraudulent activity taking place, which therefore we need to look and see the increase in the fraud referrals to investigate that.
Yeah, and I think very much like you say, people perhaps who traditionally would never think about committing fraud find themselves in really difficult situations where they feel they've got no other option. And I suppose it's important that the organisations they work for kind of stress the ways in which they can support them, maybe not necessarily providing more money, but there are counselling services, debt management services, etc., that are available for people to access as part of their employee package. And it's very important, I think, that organisations kind of raise that level of awareness, because there are other options, alternatives, and we would obviously never encourage anyone to commit crime.
Absolutely.
So
just on that point, Claire, we're literally about to produce our first edition of the rebadged Fraud Watch newsletter.
Yep.
What's that called?
Fraud Watch. And it will be available through the MIA website in the very near future. And we've got an article there for one of our colleagues around the cost of living crisis and the pressures on fraud on individuals. So, and Ruth Barker in our team, who's produced that article, does source some of the information access routes that people can get if they are suffering from financial pressures. So that information will be available, and you can get more information on that when it comes out in the Fraud Watch newsletter shortly. And what we're seeing as well, most NHS organisations have got sources of information that if you are suffering from, financial hardship or pressures, then, speak to your employer and get some information from them, because they are aware of the issue and the pressures that people are under. I think there's a related point to this that we should probably just point out as well, in that it's not our remit to really think about or be concerned about why people commit fraud.
No.
Our remit is fundamentally, have people committed fraud or not, and is there evidence to prove that or not, as the case may be.
Exactly. Once that referral is made, then an investigation is undertaken in accordance with legislative requirements. And as you say, it's irrelevant why an individual has committed fraud. The fact is that they have committed it, and therefore they will be investigated on the same basis as anybody else.
That's fundamentally for a court to decide.
Absolutely. And there could be really serious consequences, obviously, from committing fraud that individuals need to be aware of. And I'm sure we'll touch on that when we talk in a bit more detail about investigations.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that does come out when we do our investigations is actually what you were saying there, Dowell, around I don't think people quite realise the implications of what they do in that moment eventually could have on their lives, their careers, their family members, everything. And that's in the sort of moment of time that they decide to commit the fraud. I just don't think people really understand that.
Whenever I do presentations, one of the things that I sometimes say is that I can't think of many cases that I've ever investigated of fraud or instances that have been referred to me where people have committed fraud that's worth more than maybe 3, 4, 5 months of their salary. Mm-hmm. So you're basically throwing away your career. You can be being struck off as a doctor or a nurse. And what are you getting from it? Maybe a half year's salary additional. Yeah. So I think the message for that is it's not worth it.
But I think, you tend to hear these stories, don't you, on news stories about people who've committed fraud, and you hear about this jet set lifestyle they're leading. They're buying, expensive cars, big houses. They're going on, multiple foreign holidays a year. But as you said, Paul, the reality of what we deal with is people who've relatively defrauded a small amount of money and yet can have serious implications, for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. And
it's something to be aware of.
So you're listening to Talking Fraud, the MIAA Fraud podcast. The second key element of the counter-fraud strategy has been known as under the banner of prevent and deter. So this is where we get a little bit more proactive. So, we've moved beyond raising awareness, getting key messages out. This is where we actually start to sort of look into the organisation based on the principle that prevention is better than cure. Mm-hmm. So if we can prevent fraud and do things to assist the organisation preventing it from happening in the first place, then it's far better than having to sort of, be reactive and investigate something that's already occurred. So what are the key elements that we deliver under the prevent and deter banner?
So I think some of the work that we do is our local proactive exercises. So we will go out to NHS organisations, we'll look at a risk area. So that could be in procurement, it could be timesheets, overtime claims, and we'll sort of sample check that area, if you like, and look to see if there's any fraud occurred or if there's any weaknesses within systems and processes, and report that back to organisations. So ultimately we're looking for a fraud in that area, but it may be that we don't identify a fraud, but we can identify some sort of lacks in processes whereby that can assist the organisation in strengthening those to, prevent fraud in the future happening.
Fraud-proofing key systems, I think, is a key element, as well as actually testing the systems.
Yeah, I think, we all know the NHS and similar kinds of organisations. They've got procedures and policies for absolutely everything, and quite rightly so. You want them to have a procedure covering things like, procurements, covering financial transactions, covering health and safety, covering security, all those kinds of areas, let alone clinical areas. And very much, I think, part of our role is to actually look at those policies and procedures and think, do they address potential fraud issues in there? Have they got appropriate safeguards, controls in place that would help minimise fraud where it's relevant? And I think that's something very much that we need to be doing as a starting point for any work around prevention and deterrence, is making sure those systems and processes in theory are fit for purpose. And like Claire was just touching on then, is actually then going out and looking at how are they operating in practice. And I think for a long time, Claire mentioned about, trying to find fraud within a detection exercise. And it's been a situation where we've kind of been looking for a needle in a haystack, because we only have a small amount of days. We could have thousands of, say, invoices that are being processed by an organisation in a month, let alone a year. And how do you find fraud within a small sample? And I think we're looking now at using data analytics software, so we can actually target our work at particular outliers. So if you have got numerous invoices, you can break it down on value, you can break it down on bank account details, changes in bank account details. So all that that kind of additional information that sits within an electronic financial system, we can extract, interrogate, and then target our work at the areas where there potentially could be more fraud occurring.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that some of that data analysis, data matching, if you can automate it, it means you can get through larger volumes of data and transactions than you can if you're doing manual checks through spreadsheets and the like on those lines. I think another key part of the prevent and deter element of the strategy is the deterrence side of things. So generally speaking, in the public sector, particularly the NHS, we promote successful prosecutions of fraudsters to act as a deterrent to other people that might be thinking about it. Now, I think there's a distinction there between the opportunistic fraudster who just spots an opportunity and then maybe commits a fraud and doesn't do it again, or maybe sort of spots a fraud, completes it, gets away with it and decides, oh, well, I got away with it the first time, I'll do it again. And then you have the organised fraudsters who do this as a profession, do it as a living. So, I think we just need to be mindful of that. And I think prosecuting successful cases certainly, I think, probably deters the opportunists, if not maybe sort of the organised fraudsters.
No, I don't think you've got any hope with them, have you, really, to see the error of their ways and have a conversion. I think they're always going to be out there targeting, aren't they, no matter what we do. But I think,
and if they carry their frauds out on a mass scale, if they commit, 1,000 attempts at fraud, you only need a handful to be successful to make it worthwhile. So, we're sort of mindful of that particular approach, really. So that's really the prevent and deter. So that's where we get a bit more hands-on with the organisation, look at systems, procedures, make sure policies are fraud-proofed, hands-on testing, any data transactions analysis, and obviously any successful cases we promote. Yeah. We'll come to hold to account, which is essentially the investigation side of what we do in a minute. But it's probably worth just sort of talking very briefly around the strategic governance elements of what we do. So we've mentioned that we're accountable to the local organisations. We're their nominated anti-fraud specialist. Do you want to say a little bit more, Darryl, about how we operate in terms of the governance structure, the plan activities and accountability to audit committees and so on?
Yeah, I think the first kind of cornerstone of that is that we have a fixed work plan that we agree every year with our client organisations, an anti-fraud plan, and it covers the 4 key areas that we've been talking about in this podcast today. It's very much based on conducting a detailed risk assessment where we'll look at an organisation's particular fraud risk that they face. We'll also bring in national factors as well, and we'll devise a plan that addresses some of those risks. Obviously, we can't cover every single one every single year. We have to prioritise it on which we perceive to either be the most likely to occur or which would have perhaps the most impact on an organisation were it to be successful. And then throughout the course of the year, we will obviously deliver elements of the plan that we've agreed. And accountability is very important. So we will be reporting to Senior Finance Officer, Director of Finance, Chief Finance Officer as to the progress that we're being made. But that's only one aspect of the way in which we're held to account by an organisation. We also have, as Paul mentioned, to attend audit committees, normally 3 or 4 times a year. And again, we're presenting the progress on the work that we've undertaken, and we're open then to scrutiny by executives and non-executive directors who sit on those committees whose job it is to make sure that we are delivering the service that we said we'd provide. So that's obviously a very important aspect of our job. We take that very seriously. We prepare for those meetings and make sure that we're able to effectively convey the nature of the work that we've been undertaking. There are also a suite of national fraud standards. There are 12 components within the standard that we have to evidence compliance against, or rather we have to evidence on behalf of the organisations we work for the level of compliance. And a self-assessment return is submitted to the Counter Fraud Authority every year, where we indicate on a scale of red, amber or green the level of compliance with each particular area. And that information is then collated by the Counter Fraud Authority to provide some benchmarking information across the NHS. And it's also potentially used at times for them to focus either the conducting of inspections or targeted thematic reviews in particular areas where they may feel there is a general weakness across the country, or indeed they're seeking to identify good practice which they can share with other organisations. So all of that information can be of benefit to both our clients and to ourselves in directing then future years counter fraud work.
So the fourth component, and the last component really in terms of the strategy itself, is probably possibly the most interesting one, and the one that people are more interested in when we sort of do presentations and talk about fraud. And that's really what's called hold to account, but fundamentally is the investigative side of things as well. Do you want to explain a little bit about what NHS counter-fraud investigation generally consists of?
As our expert.
Yes.
No pressure. Yeah, so obviously the whole account element of the our fraud plans is around the investigation work that we do. So our staff are all professionally qualified investigators, and they come from a various number of backgrounds, be it DWP in internal audit and also local authority. So we do have a wide range of staff working. And obviously each organisation potentially may have a number of referrals every year. So some of those, the majority of those will come to the local counter-fraud specialist, anti-fraud specialist of that organisation to make an assessment of, to investigate, and potentially, our aim is that if we believe a fraud has been committed and we've got evidence to support it, is to prosecute an individual in the court of law. And we have had some successful cases through MIAA's investigations. There's also been some national cases as well around that. So
we don't just prosecute though, do we? We work with the organisation. So, we can, if the evidence is there, we will pursue a prosecution. We work with Counter Fraud Authority to do that, obviously the Crown Prosecution Service.
Absolutely.
Sometimes we might need to go to the police.
Yes, so we do joint cases with the police. We may do joint cases with Immigration, UK Border Agency. So we do a number of investigations, and then once we've conducted our investigations, as Paul just pointed out, we go through, if it's a NHS-led investigation, we will go through the NHS Counter Fraud Authority, who then link in with the Crown Prosecution Service, and we will look to prosecute individuals. There could be cases where, I've done several myself with the local police force, where we are assisting them on an investigation, and it may be that they'll take the investigation and then that'll be prosecuted through their authority rather than the NHS, but obviously it may still be an NHS offence. And that can be various things. I've done some cases recently with the local police around identity fraud, people working within the NHS who are not who they say they are. I've previously had cases around practice manager frauds, and it could be that we ask people to come in for what's called a voluntary interview under caution. If people choose not to come in, they don't want to come in, it may be that we ask for some assistance with the police in terms to get that person presented to be interviewed. So it could be, a matter of them being arrested and then we'll interview them in a police station, or it could still be classed as a voluntary interview but being conducted in the police. So, there are whole different rafts as to how we conduct our investigations, whether it's, just an actual NHS-led investigation with just NHS staff investigators, or whether it's something that we do jointly. But also, just I suppose to give a bit of background, the NHS Counter Fraud Authority also have a national investigation team. So it could be that, they're investigating something that could be connected to one of our clients. And they're doing that because it, as Paul, I think, previously alluded to, crosses over boundaries, borders, but also it could be that it's an organised fraud type area as well.
I mean, another key element of this part of the strategy was the multi-track approach to pursuing fraudsters. So obviously if the individual is employed by the NHS organisation, they may also be subject to a disciplinary investigation.
Yeah.
And if they're a professional, they may also be referred to their professional body. Hence the reason why you can have somebody who's sacked from the place of work, prosecuted, but also dismissed as a professional.
Absolutely,
as well.
yes.
And I think the other key element is really the redress. So a key cornerstone of the strategy is if people have taken money out of the NHS, it's getting that money back, if we can prove it, getting it back into the NHS. And this is where people will get prosecuted, there'll be financial redress.
Yeah.
People may even get their pensions taken off them.
You can find MIAA's Talking Fraud through all the usual podcast platforms.